Hi, and welcome to Lecture 4 of Advanced Strategy and Analytics. In this lecture, we are going to be going over structured problem solving. We'll first start off by going over a brief introduction of just what structured problem solving is. Then we'll be going into qualifying, which is how to thoroughly understand a problem. We'll then be going over some of the most common frameworks for approaching problems in a structured manner, and then we'll finally end on brainstorming. Before we get started, I want to give a quick shout out to Barbara Minto. Barbara Minto was the first person, not just the first woman, but the first person to introduce structured problem solving to the business world. And her work has undoubtedly had a major impact, not just on the business world, but the world at large. Barbara Minto was part of the first female cohort in Harvard Business School. She was the first MBA hire at McKinsey & Company back in 1963. She developed the pyramid principle, which is widely considered as one of the best methods for clear and effective communication. Her work has not only been adopted by most of the major consulting firms, but has also been adopted by most Fortune 500 companies. And they all fall back on a lot of the frameworks that she primarily developed in order to be able to solve their problems. I would also like to point out that over the decades, governments around the world have become increasingly reliant on consulting firms to solve their problems. The consulting firms helped reshape the healthcare industry by applying value chain analysis to it, which has helped hospitals become much more efficient in their ability to have patients come in and get patients out quicker, which has undoubtedly saved millions and millions of lives. Consulting firms are active in helping solve social issues around the world. For instance, trying to get out the COVID vaccine the, to combat the coronavirus. Consulting firms played a major role in there. And so we don't realize this, but consulting firms have a large impact on society. And these consulting firms, when they go out to solve society's problems, they use Minto's frameworks that she developed to be able to tackle these challenges. So I just want to give her some credit where credit is due. I've heard a lot of people talk about the pyramid principle, and a lot of people know about some of the frameworks that she has developed. Seldom, though, do I meet anybody that actually knows who is the one that developed the pyramid principle, and I rarely hear anybody give Barbara Minto the credit that she deserves. So I only thought it was appropriate to start off with this. You'll notice if you look at the sources for most of the slides throughout this deck, a lot of them will cite Minto or McKinsey, and just about all that work, most of the principles that you'll see in this deck can be traced back to her. There are two main ways you can approach a problem. You can either approach a problem inductively or deductively. When you approach a problem inductively, what that means is you will look at data or you will look at observations and then you'll come to a conclusion from that observation. When you approach a problem deductively, on the other hand, you start out with a quote-unquote conclusion or what's known as a hypothesis, and then you'll look for observations to prove that hypothesis. These two examples here. For instance, with deductive logic, you can see that you have this statement here that we know birds can fly. We know that to be true. Then we say we know that I am a bird, and we know that to be true. Therefore, we can deduce from these two statements that since I am a bird, therefore I can fly. And in this case, we haven't actually witnessed that I can fly, but since we know that I'm a bird, and then since we know that birds can fly, therefore we can deduce that I can fly without observing that I can actually fly. And from that hypothesis, we can then go ahead and test it to actually see if I could fly or not. This is an example of inductive logic. We see that French tanks are at the Polish border. We also say that German tanks are at the Polish border, and we see that Russian tanks are at the Polish border. Therefore, because we've made these observations, we can then assume that Poland is probably about to be invaded by tanks. Now, when taking a structured approach to problem solving, we tend to use deductive logic. And the reason why we use deductive logic, and as you can see in these diagrams, is because we have a structure where things connect to and things lead to. Where in the inductive logic, things are all just kind of together, and there's not really that same sense of structure that we would have in the deductive logic. Deductive logic is reliant on having structure, because deductive logic does not rely on a lot of data. It will use only the necessary data that is needed to be able to prove the hypothesis statement. Inductive logic, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily need to have a structure because you have all this data. For instance, going back here, if I see that I fly, I do not have to put together this structure that birds fly. I do not have to put this structure that birds fly, and I am a bird to be able to determine that I fly. Now, while inductive logic may seem appealing because it somewhat intuitively just makes sense, the reason why we focus on deductive logic is because we usually don't have all the data in the world at our disposal. And even if we do have all the data in the world at our disposal, then there's the problem of boiling the ocean or trying to find out what data is actually relevant to what we want to do. What deductive logic is so good at doing is by presenting a hypothesis and by presenting a structure to prove that hypothesis, it then tells you very specifically what data you need to get to be able to prove that hypothesis. Inductive logic does not have this. Merely the power of inductive logic is just to make observations off the current data that you have, and it doesn't give you a good sense of where to go to get the data that you need to get. So when we are problem solving, we have a very specific problem with a potential answer that we are looking to solve. If we want to solve that problem in the most efficient manner possible, then we want to know specifically what data we will need to get to be able to solve that problem, and we don't want to spend our time boiling the ocean. That is why we would use deductive logic. And for the rest of this presentation, we'll be going over deductive reasoning. At its heart, structured problem solving is all about breaking a problem down in a logical way into more bite-sized pieces that make it easier for you to be able to manage the problem to solve it. The basic steps with problem solving is that first, you're going to want to frame the problem to really figure out what that problem is that you are trying to solve. Then you're going to try to figure out what is the analysis that you're going to need to be able to solve that problem and pair your analysis with the problem that you have. Then you're going to go out and you're going to gather the data to be able to support that analysis, to be able to solve your problem. And then finally, you're going to look at the results of your analysis and interpret them, and you'll finally be able to solve the problem. When you frame a problem, you want to be able to clearly define what the problem is and then really focus in on what the specific root cause of the problem is. You can do this through the application of frameworks or trying to figure out what are the drivers or the key factors that affect the problem. Then you want to figure out how you're going to go about solving the problem. You'll develop hypotheses, you'll develop frameworks, and you'll establish a methodology for being able to iterate on your hypotheses and to be able to update them. Once you have your hypotheses designed, then you can go ahead and design analysis. You can figure out what is the type of analysis that you'll need to pair to be able to prove your hypotheses. Then you can go move forward once you have your analysis designed and gathered the data necessary to support your analysis. And you can then use that data to then and solve the problem. You want to always check the results of the data that you ask the famous so what question, or really what impact does this analysis have, or why is it relevant, and then finally find a way to synthesize your results and findings that you can deliver as a solution. Now we'll go over qualifying, and I just want to say this is usually what trips people up. More often than not, most people will just skip this stage and they'll go straight into trying to solve the problem. However, if you try to solve a problem without thoroughly understanding the problem, you are setting yourself up for failure. When working with someone to solve a problem, it is critical that you exercise compassion to properly be able to qualify the problem, to put yourself in a position where you can ask those questions to be able to better define the problem so you can get a holistic understanding of what's really going on before you dive into solving it. There are three main steps to doing this. You want to, one, ask permission to ask questions to help build collaboration. Two, you want to explain why you are asking a certain question so you can show compassion. And three, you want to use questions to help identify the root problem to better be able to define what is really going on. The reason why you want to ask permission to ask questions is you want to establish yourself as a peer or somebody that you can collaborate with this person to show them that you are a friend, to be there, to be able to help them. And two, you want to make sure that you are not coming across as intrusive or prying, and that they are with you and trying to help solve this problem. You also, moving forward, want to be careful. You want to be careful to balance you asking them questions and them asking you questions. It's best to think about it that you want to move forward when helping another person to solve a problem as an equal partner. And if you can show this, you are greatly building your trust with that person. Next, you want to explain why you're asking a certain question. What this really allows you to do is show the person that you're trying to determine what they are trying to do, and that you also genuinely care about what they're trying to do. In doing this, you show careful vulnerability on your side to expose the fact that you don't know the answer yet. And you do this in the way that you ask the question. And then finally, when you do ask the questions, you want to do so in a way that shows genuine understanding of where they're coming from. You want to ask questions in a way that really helps them to communicate what their problem is, and this will help you to get deeper into what the root cause of the problem is, and it'll put you in a position for you to more effectively be able to solve it. Now, I'll give a quick example. Now, say the COO of a major global corporation comes up to me and asks for help with their France division, specifically with the revenue performance of their France division. Now, before diving into trying to solve the problem and help them, I would first ask, would it be okay if I can ask a couple questions about the France division? And then they'll probably say, sure, go ahead. And then I'll say, okay, Well, first, I just want to let you know that the reason why I'm going to ask the questions that I'm about to ask is that I want to better understand specifically what you want to achieve. I want to understand why you're coming to me, as well as I also want to understand how the France division impacts that so that I can best help you. And what that really does is by explaining out why I'm asking the question, the person can say, okay, they are really trying to see things from my perspective. They're really trying to discern what needs to happen, or oh, I see, that's why they're asking this. They're really trying to help me here, rather than if I just go off and I start spattering off questions like, well, how much revenue did the France division have? How much market share does the France division have? Well, how was the store managers in France? You see, if I start asking just shooting off all these questions, it can come out across as almost belligerent. And what that sometimes can do is it can make that person feel very vulnerable because essentially what you're coming in and doing is you're exposing their weakness. Now, it's important to expose that weakness in order to solve the problem, but before you can go forth in exposing that weakness, you need to make sure that you're coming at it from a place of compassion and trust, that that person sees that the reason why you're exposing these weaknesses is because you're there to help them. And so it's very important how you go about setting up the questions you ask. And ultimately, this is critical because you need to have the person sufficiently open up to you so you can actually discern the root of the problem and be able to effectively solve the problem, because you won't be able to effectively solve the problem if you cannot find out the root. I'm sure we've all been in a situation in life where maybe we've had a hard day or we've had something that's happened, and then we go off to a friend and we explain our problem to them. And then it almost seems like before we can even finish explaining that problem, that friend is already there trying to solve our problem for us. And what it kind of does is it puts us in a state where we feel kind of exposed. We feel weak for having this problem, especially since they're able to give a solution so quickly. And oftentimes the solution isn't even relevant to what is going on. And it just makes us get more defensive. Now, more often than not, in those situations, there's a much deeper root problem that's going on there. Yeah, I might go to a friend and share this problem that I have. I might go up to a friend and share that, oh, I just failed the test. But the solution I'm looking for is not that, oh, I need to have a plan for how I can flip my grade around and bring everything back on track. What the real problem is, I failed a test and now my self-worth, I'm feeling somewhat worthless because of that. And what I really need is somebody there to be able to address my needs. So what an amateur problem solver would do is they would just go ahead and try to, I would say, whatever the surface level problem is, oh, I failed this test. They would try to solve that problem. However, a professional problem solver, what they would do is they'd say, oh, tell me more about that. They'd really try to understand, how did that test make you feel? What was that feeling that you had when you failed this test? And perhaps they could realize that right now I'm not actually too worried about the test itself. It's more of how I'm feeling. And by discerning that, they know they can provide that listening ear to be able to be there for me and help actually address the root problem that I am facing. Now, this is the exact same with organizations and corporations at large. More often than not, the role of a consultant is really a lot more like a corporate therapist. They're there to listen, to be compassionate, and to really help understand what the root problem, what are the root pain points that an organization is going through. And once they are able to understand those root problems and those pain points, they can then use that information to help the corporation to be able to solve whatever problems that it faces in a very effective manner. One last thing before we move on. The next time you're in an interview and an interviewer asks in a job interview and an interviewer asks you a question, ask yourself this. What is the root problem here that they want me to solve? Is it really they want me to give the answer to this question? Or is the real problem that they're facing is that they're interviewing probably 20 other people that day and they're tired and they still have work to do on top of that, and they are trying to find a way to differentiate interviewees from each other. And they want to be able to select, and they feel the immense pressure of having to select the best interviewee there. So next time you go into an interview, really consider what is the root problem that your interviewer is trying to solve, and really try to be compassionate and put yourself in their perspective. If you do this, you will be able to understand how you can best be able to help them to make the decisions that they are looking to make. Now that we've built that environment that we can start asking questions, we then want to know how we can go about asking the right questions so that we can be able to get to the root of the problem and be able to best solve it. So the way that you're going to want to go about doing this is you want to start with the end in mind. You want to define the problem in terms of the results that your client wants to get. You'll do this by first identifying what type of problem they're trying to solve, and then take the broad problem and really focus and narrow it in, getting very specific about what are the results that will come from the problem solving. So going back to my friend, the COO. So he may come up to me and ask me, well, we need help with our France's division's revenue. Well, okay, every problem will either go down into, well, do you want to you either want to explain some results or you want to get new or different results. So it might be, I might ask, well, are you asking why, or he might ask, why was revenue so low in France last year? And he wants to know a reason behind this. Or he might ask, how can we increase revenue in France this next year? So here he doesn't necessarily care as much about the reason, but he wants to know what to do to get a new result. So in this case, let's just assume that he asks about why revenue was so low in France this last year. Well, the first thing that we'd want to do is get more specific in our problem. So maybe we would push a little bit and ask, um, well, when you say low, what specifically are you comparing France to? And then he may come back to me and say, well, why was revenue lower in France than it was in Italy? Okay, and that gives us a solid place where we can start out, but then we might want to dig one step deeper and we may want to ask, well, why was revenue per store lower in France than Italy? Now we're starting to get something a little bit more tangible that we can really compare. We might even want to get more specific and we might want to ask, well, was there a certain season or a certain time that revenue per store was lower in France than Italy? And he might come back and say, yes. Well, I want to know, why was revenue per store lower in France, lower or in France than Italy during the fall season? Okay, so now we have something a lot more granular that's a lot more specific, but let's go one step further. We want to quantize it, and we'll ask, well, how much lower was revenue was the per store revenue in France than it was in Italy during the fall season. And then he may come back to me and say, well, it was 18% lower. And we want to know, why was revenue per store 18% lower in France than Italy during the fall season? Now, what this does is this gives me a very specific problem I can investigate and I can go ahead and tackle. If I'm just given this problem, we need help with our France division's revenue, then maybe the first thing I might say is, oh, well, just outsource this, or here, try this new framework or something, or whatever, and I might give a solution that is completely different than what they're really wanting to know. But now with this, I know specifically they want to know why. They're not looking for some kind of innovation or something to help them make new money. They're more, or to increase revenue in France. They're looking for a very specific reason as to why the performance of the French stores were lower than the Italian stores. And this puts me in a position where I can very easily go from this problem and then turn it into a framework to be able to solve and investigate. Because it's very clear what I need to do. I need to look at the French stores. I need to get data about the France stores. I need to get data about the Italian stores, and I need to get that data for during the fall season. I need to then investigate this 18% difference and try to determine what is the key driver of that 18% difference. And if I can find the key driver of this 18% difference, that will ultimately solve the problem that the client is coming to me with. Now, I'll just make this comment about going through this process and defining. It is very important that you do start with the end in mind, that you know where you're going with your questions to get here. You want to follow this specific path of really properly diagnosing what the problem is, and then really coming in and focusing on what the person wants to achieve. I know I've seen this a lot of times in practice case interviews where I'm casing with other people. And a lot of times they know that they're supposed to go through this process of qualifying and asking questions. But more often than not, when I'm on the other side of casing, what I see happen is somebody will just come up to me and they'll ask 5 random questions that don't really have anything to do. They'll ask, like, in this case, they might ask, well, what was how many other divisions do you have in Europe? And then I'd give them an answer. Then they'd say, well, how many employees do you have in France? And I might give them a number, and they're like, well, is France usually a lower or higher revenue than other places? And so forth. And they'll ask a bunch of questions that don't really have any structure to it. And going back to the last slide, they won't really explain why they're asking the questions. It becomes very evident that the only reason they're asking the questions is just to check off a box to say that yes, they qualified and they asked the questions. But the reality is they're not actually getting to the root problem. And sometimes this process doesn't take very long. Sometimes the customer or the client might straight up come to you with this problem. We want to know why revenue per store was 18% lower in France than Italy during the fall season. And then of course it's always important to just ask some constraints or parameters that you want to operate within. But in that case, there's not a lot of diagnosing that you need to do. Other times, though, you can get something very vague and something that's all over the place, and it can take a lot of qualifying to really get to this state. But just make sure when you are asking the questions to try to figure out what the root problem is, that you are beginning with the end in mind and that all your questions are focused on getting to this point over here. Now that we have properly qualified the problem and we have very clearly defined what the problem is that we're trying to solve, we'll now are going to go into frameworks for how to approach a problem, starting off with answer first, also known as the scientific method. Now, one quick comment I do want to make about all these frameworks is they're not mutually exclusive, but rather they're all very similar in the way that they go about solving problems. They're just different ways to think about how you approach a problem. So don't think about like these are the completely different types of ways you go about solving a problem. All of them have a lot of overlap with each other, but rather these are just kind of three different ways how you might think about going about solving a problem. Okay, the answer first approach takes a deductive approach to solving a problem. You start out with the hypothesis, you will give your answer, and then you will then find assumptions. And the way this goes is that given that your assumptions are true, then your answer will be true. So if you can properly frame what your answer is and you can find assumptions that given that those assumptions are true, your answer would be true, all you need to do is then find supporting data and analysis. And if you're able to prove your assumptions, then you're able to go ahead and solve your problem. Now, I do really quickly want to point out, whenever you write a rhetorical essay, this is usually the approach that you follow. You will state, here is my thesis. Here is my assumptions or topics that back up my thesis. Now I'm going to go into paragraph 1, which is going to talk about topic 1. In my paragraph 1, I am going to have quotes or data or supporting details that an analysis of those supporting details that supports my first topic or my first assumption. So forth with paragraph 2, so forth with paragraph 3. And through that, hopefully, you have made a case that supports your answer. So with the answer first, you want to first start off by generating hypotheses and then building out assumptions that would have to be true for those hypotheses to be true. And then you really quickly want to eliminate hypotheses based off the merit of your assumptions. Now you can do this with something called the quick and dirty test. Really what that does is it allows you to take a hypothesis and take a look at the assumptions, and you can very quickly identify if an assumption is plausible or not. If an assumption is so far-fetched that or that you know for sure that it's not true, you can very quickly eliminate that hypothesis, and that allows you to really focus on hypotheses that are worthy to actually go ahead and analyze. So we see here we have this problem, how to increase the profitability of rebar. So we have this hypothesis here, and our hypothesis is that rebar probability can be increased with a new production and process. Well, then we got to think about like, well, okay, what has to be true? What has to be true for this hypothesis to be true? Well, first one, we'd have to answer the question, would introducing a new production process actually reduce costs? That's one assumption that we'd need to be able to prove true. Another one is, can our organization implement the necessary changes for this process? Because if our organization can't, then there's really no point in even going about this. And number three, like, can we maintain the same level of product quality when we do this, when we implement this process? Because if we lose product quality, that even if we are saving on costs, that's ultimately going to affect our revenue, which is going to decrease profitability. We can even go When tackling out these sub-issues, we can then even go deeper and then ask questions like, for instance, can our organization handle this? We can ask, well, does the process require any special facilities? Or does this process require any special skills? And then what this does is it frames us in a position where it's very easy to go ahead and answer these questions. We can go and do analysis of, okay, this is how much this procedure is going to reduce costs. This is the special facilities that we'd need. This is the special skill that we'd need. Does our organization already have this skill or not? And then in this process, would we be able to maintain the quality? And if we can say that, yes, it will reduce costs, that yes, our organization can implement these changes because we do have the necessary facilities and skills needed, and yes, we can maintain production quality, then we have a very strong case to say that our hypothesis holds and that our hypothesis will solve the problem. Then from here, we can turn this into a plan of action that we can go ahead and execute on to be able to figure out if our hypothesis will hold. Now in consulting, we work with these kind of plans all the time. You'll usually have a partner that will be the one that kind of goes ahead and solves the problem. Then you'll have a manager that will break down and kind of organize out the problem. They will figure out all the analysis that needs to be done, and they'll assign different analysts to go ahead and be able to prove these assumptions. And then the analysts will go ahead and investigate all these assumptions and prove it. And the hope is that within this time, some kind of deck will be put together. First slide will have a chart, the next one will have a list, the next one will have a chart, so on, so on. That will then be able to make a case that, yes, these assumptions hold up and are true, and therefore implementing a new production process will increase rebar profitability. Answer first is a widely used approach by most of the major consulting firms, and it's usually how you start out to tackle any big organizational problem. Now we'll be going over mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, also known as MECE. Now I do want to point out that the creator of MECE, Barbara Minto, pronounces it as MECE. However, I have really only heard it been pronounced as MECE. If you go to Wikipedia, it also states that it's pronounced as MECE, and most commonly in the business world, people refer to this framework as MECE. So maybe we might see a shift from MECE to MECE, but for the sake of keeping it consistent with most people's understandings, I'm going to continue to call it MECE for this presentation. So the MECE framework is all about grouping ideas into categories that covers everything but keeps everything separate, hence mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So when you group items into a category, an item can only belong to a single category at a time. For instance, item 1 and item 2 are in category 1, therefore they cannot be part of category 2. Same thing, item 3 is in category 2, therefore it can't also be part of category 1. In addition, everything in category 1 plus everything in category 2 must equal everything that there is. Or in other words, that you can't have anything left out of categories. This is a very simple way, but a very good way to be able to break things down into smaller subcomponents without losing anything in the process. So, for instance, here we have a list. Our list is of the letters from A to K. So right now, we have just grouped them in one single category. So this is MECE because this category covers everything. Everything is just in one category. So it fulfills being mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Now, we can break this into two categories. We have this category here, category 1 and category 2. And category 1 and 2 are mutually exclusive. All the letters in category 1 are only in category 1, and all the letters in category 2 are only in category 2. So these two categories are mutually exclusive. And we also still have all the letters from A to K, so therefore this structure is also collectively exhaustive. And take it even another step further, we can have subcategory X, subcategory Y, subcategory Z, and subcategory W. So we can look at this. First, all of these categories are mutually exclusive because each of the letters only belongs to the one category. We don't have any letters belonging to any other categories. And it's still collectively exhausted because each category together contains all the letters from A to K. Likewise, category 1 and category 2 also contain all the subcategories together, making these two categories collectively exhausted, and each subcategory only belongs to one category, making it mutually exclusive. So what I find MECE most powerful for is being able to diagnose problems because of its ability to organize ideas and cover everything and not leave anything out. So for instance, if I lost my phone, my problem is I want to know where my phone is. So I can first start out and say by saying that I know that my phone is somewhere in the universe. I am certain that my phone is at some point in space in the universe. Now, from there, I know that seems a little bit absurd and obvious, but I can then move from there and start to break that down into different buckets. And I might first start out by breaking it down into, okay, I can then say that my phone is either in my apartment or it's outside of my apartment, and we can check if this is MECE. If my phone is in my apartment, then it can't be outside the apartment. Also, if my phone is outside the apartment, that means it can't be in the apartment. And if all locations inside my apartment and all locations outside of my apartment cover all possible points of space within the universe, so it's still collectively exhaustive. Then I can go a step further and I can break this down, break down this into buckets, saying that, well, if it's outside of my apartment, it's either at school or it's not at school. Or if it's in my apartment, I can say that, well, it's either my bedroom, the other bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen, or the living room. And if my phone is in any one of these rooms, then I can know that it's not in the other room. So they're all mutually exclusive from each other. Also, if my phone is in one of these rooms, then it's not at school, or it's not outside of school, outside of the apartment. And all of these locations, my living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, the other bathroom, my room, school, and not at school and not at the apartment, those locations together all cover all possible points of space in the universe, so it's collectively exhausted. So then now that I've broken this down into much more manageable sized buckets, I can then go ahead and decide, okay, out of all these locations, which one do I think is most likely of where my phone might be? And this is where we have some overlap with answer first. I would make a hypothesis that my phone is in my room, and therefore I'm going to start looking there. And so you can see that MECE is really a great framework for setting problems up. Here's another use case of MECE. We can take almost an identical methodology from the previous slide and apply it to something a little bit more business relevant, like let's try to figure out how we can increase the operating income of Amazon. So I can start off with the operating income. I know that income is made up of revenue and expenses, and that these two categories are the drivers of income. And then I can break that further down into, okay, we have our net product sales, our net service sales, then we have our cost of goods sold, we have fulfillment, marketing, technology, admin, and other expenses. And now that I have these buckets, I can quickly look at which ones that I might want to investigate to be able to increase the profits. Now, first I can choose, okay, do I think that I want to focus on revenue or operating expenses? And I might think, I want to look at how can we make Amazon more efficient? How can we bring down their operating expenses? So I might look through these different categories and I look at cost of goods sold. I see that's the highest, but then I also realize that there's not a lot you can do to affect cost of goods sold. But then I look over here and I see technology, and technology looks rather high. So maybe I want to investigate that. And perhaps there's places we can find ways how to reduce the costs in the technology bucket. But this is just one example about how MECE can put you in a position to go ahead and form a hypothesis and solve a problem. Okay, now I want you to all take a minute, pause this video if you'd like, but try to think to yourself, why is or are these groups on the left MECE and these groups on the right not MECE? Pause and take a minute to think about that. Okay, let's investigate this. So, what we notice here is that all of these items only belong to a single category. So all of these groups, proteins, fruits, and vegetables, they are all mutually exclusive. We also notice that all items belong to a group, therefore making these groups collectively exhausted. Now we look over here. We notice that eggs is in both the proteins group and the round objects group. That means that the categories of proteins and round objects are not mutually exclusive because they share eggs. In addition, we see carrots is not in a group. It's not in the proteins group or the round objects groups. And thus, we see that the groups of protein and round objects are not collectively exhausted because carrots does not fit in either one of these groups. Therefore, making these groups not mutually exclusive and collectively exhausted. These groups are not MECE. Okay, and now we are going to be going over mathematical modeling or taking a computational approach. This is really similar to the other two methods, but it really does provide a more granular analysis and a more computational rigor to going about solving problems. So the basic way that any mathematical modeling is done is you want to try to describe the real world or some kind of result within the terms of that can be broken down into mathematical functions. So you'll have all these factors, and when you put these factors together, they will equal some kind of result. Usually a factor is made up of an input times some kind of weight. You might also have a bias or a factor that isn't made up of an input but is just there on its own. And then when you take all these different factors together, you can then be able to frame it, or you organize and structure these factors in such a way that it turns into an equation that gets you the result that you want to get. One key element to mathematical modeling is everything that you do, you should be able to plug numbers into it. You should also be able to program what you are doing. This is really what makes mathematical modeling so powerful, especially compared to the other two types of structured problem solving that we went over, because if you're able to create a mathematical model, you have the potential of then automating that model and then solving problems widespread on a much greater scale. Now, while mathematical models do have improved efficiency over the other types of problem solving that we went over, what they lack is sometimes flexibility or being able to fit to a certain problem. However, with the advances in machine learning and specifically with neural networks, we're seeing that mathematical modeling is pushing that boundary. So here is one very common use case with mathematical modeling. Given that you have sufficient data, something that you can do is you can run something called a regression analysis on your data between two variables to help you understand the relationship between those two variables, and those two variables, or the relationship between those two variables, understanding that can help you to solve whatever your problem is. So for instance here, we have two problems. Our first problem is, how does price affect how many tickets we sell? So we want to figure out what is the relationship between price and um, the number of tickets we sold. So if we were going back to the qualifying slides, that's an explanation problem. Then over here we have, how can we use price to maximize our revenue? Now this is how can we change a certain result. So this is how can we explain a certain result, and this is how we can change a result. So one way we can go about doing that is we can collect some data. We might have different nights where we are selling tickets at different prices. And then we'll collect data from those different nights that have those different ticket prices, and we'll try to figure out what is the quantity that of tickets that people will buy given a certain price, and then we can plot those points. Then we can use a regression to draw a line through these different points to then be able to establish the relationship between price and quantity. So we can see here that we would want price to be the input. And if we take price and then put it with some kind of weights, put those together, that will get out our target, which is quantity. And from running this model, we can then say, well, when somebody asks, how does price affect how many tickets are sold? We can say something like, well, with every $1 increase of ticket price, we see that the number of tickets sold roughly falls by 81 tickets. And if we even want to go into more detail, we can get into the actual numbers and the direct relationship that they have. And then going on to the next problem, how can we use this price to maximize our revenue? Well, all what we need to do now is we have basically this function for our input. We have this function for our target, which is quantity, and we know that revenue is quantity times price. So if we take this function that we have that gives us quantity and then multiply it by price, we'll then get another curve that shows how much revenue that we have. Then we just take the derivative of that curve and solve for wherever the local maximum point is, and then that will tell us at what price will we get the most amount of money. And if we go through that mathematical rigor, we will then see that we make the most amount of the maximum revenue that we could achieve based on this model that we have is $156.94 per night. And in order to achieve that level of revenue, we'll have to price our tickets at $1.46. So if we price our tickets at $1.46, this is our expected revenue. I'm going to run through some more examples here. Here's another common one. Weighted averages are very good for being able to determine a big picture or a macro measurement. based on a lot of smaller factors. Here we see that our problem is how will my stock portfolio perform in conjunction to the S&P 500. So what I can do is I can take all my different stocks. I know that all my stocks have different weights in my portfolio. I can take the beta of each one of these stocks, and the beta is simply a measurement of the core or how correlated each stock is to the S&P 500. And then if I multiply these betas by the weights, I will get weighted betas, and if I put them together, I can then know my portfolio beta. Another really common use case of using mathematical modeling is for top-down approaches, especially for something like market sizing or figuring out demand. For instance, in this problem, I am launching an online website for my ice cream shop, and I want to try to figure out how much traffic that ice cream shop may experience. So what I could do is I would work backwards and I'd think, okay, what is going to drive or what is going to lead people to coming to my ice cream shop? Well, the only real reason that people really come to my ice cream shop is orders. So I could take from the number of orders, I know that a percentage of the people that come to my ice cream shop make an order. And then so I can reverse think that. So if I know my conversion rate and if I know how many orders I am forecasted to make, I can take my forecasted orders by my conversion rate, and that would get me how many daily visitors I would be expected. Well, then I have to figure out how many orders I'd have. So I would go back and then I'd try to figure out, okay, so how would I be able to establish how many orders I'd get? And I might first think about, well, what is the demand for ice cream domestically? Like how many people want ice cream? And I might look at the total population of the United States. From that, I can boil it down to, okay, I know from the Census Bureau how many servings of ice cream Americans consume on a daily basis, multiply that out. Now I know on a daily basis that Americans have about 58.3 million servings of ice cream. So then I can take that, and if that is all the ice cream that is being sold, I can then look at, well, what is my market share within that market? Or of all the ice cream that is being eaten on a daily basis, how much of that do I own? And then I'll apply whatever my current market share into that. And from my current market share, I can then translate that into my estimated daily orders for my ice cream chain. And now that I have daily orders, I can then plug that into my conversion rates, and from there I'll be able to figure out on average, get a pretty good estimate for how many daily visitors I would have for my website. And then this is important because I can then take this information to figure out what kind of IT infrastructure needs I'll need to have. But what I have down here is I have this model that will give me the answer that I'm looking for. And all what I have to do is plug in my variables here, my numeric variables, and they'll get me the numeric answer that I'm trying to achieve. Lastly, when you're trying to capture nonlinear relationships between variables or very complicated relationships, say something like how do the pixels in an image correspond to what that image is about? That is a very complex, complicated relationship that cannot easily be described in a linear fashion, and if it is described in a linear fashion, it will probably be widely incorrect and off. So the solution to that is You can take all these weights and biases that we were talking about a little bit earlier and then arrange them into a network of nodes. And by arranging them into a network of nodes, what you're almost doing is creating almost like a hierarchy of functions that all that are all contained together. So it's almost like you're creating a function within a function. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to capture non-linearity, or more precisely, it allows you to very much approximate long non-linearity. One way you can think about this is if you've ever taken a square, you've taken a hey, say like a triangle or something, and then you add a side, all of a sudden it looks like it's a square. Then you add another side to it and it's a pentagon. Then you add another side to it and it's a hexagon. And you keep adding more and more sides to the square. And each one of those sides is a straight line. It is a linear line. However, as you keep adding more and more and more sides to this polygon, pretty soon you have something that looks like a circle. Is it a circle? It's not a circle because it's still composed of sides. However, once you get to say like 1,000 different sides on a polygon, it very much looks like a circle and very closely approximates nonlinearity. And that's kind of the same thing that a network of nodes is doing. Is what happens with a network of nodes is just like our linear regression earlier that we talked about earlier, each one of these nodes is essentially running some kind of regression function. And so if each one of these nodes is kind of running its own linear regression, and what that allows is for, rather than a line, you start getting something a lot more similar to a curve. And these curves, depending on how many nodes you get, can be very complex and can fit and show relationships between variables that are very complicated. In machine learning, what we refer to these as is neural networks. These are the type of algorithms that are able to do image recognition or to do speech processing or to do any of those, to solve any of those kind of problems that are far too complicated for any standard model to tackle. And so the way this works is in a neural network, you'll have your inputs, and these inputs will then be multiplied by these weights. Now there's a lot of them, so it's really hard to see, but the way this is represented is if, say, like this input right here is equal to 1, that means I am going to multiply 1 by negative 2.10407, and then that's going to go here. And I'll do the same for all of these other inputs, and they are all by whatever weights are here, and I'll add them all together. I'll get the sum of that. I'll also add this bias of 0.40719 to this node, and I sum that all together. I get a new number on this node. And I'd go ahead and I do the same thing for all these different nodes. Then after I get the numbers, the results of all these different nodes, I repeat the process again to all of these nodes until finally that all translates to whatever my target variable is. And if you look over here, now to tie things back to previous lectures, this may look familiar. This should look like the state spaces we talked about. And essentially that's all that a state space is doing. Is a state space is a representation of some kind of model like this. And so as you can see, problem solving, machine learning, strategy, they all do really tie together at the more fundamental levels of the principles that they're hitting on. Now finally, we're going to talk about brainstorming. Now, structured brainstorming is a way how to generate ideas in an organized fashion to be able to get to what to generate the idea that you're looking for as efficiently as possible. To go about doing this, what you'll do is you'll first start out by listing out ideas horizontally, or you'll list out ideas that are all in the same category. Once you've listed out what you felt like is sufficient ideas, you'll look at all those ideas, and then from those ideas, you'll choose one, and then you'll move vertically down on that idea, and then expand that idea further, and then continue listing out horizontally. And you'll repeat this process over and over again until you finally reach the level of granularity that you're looking to reach, and you reach the idea that you desired. So for instance, if my problem is I'm wondering what I should get my child for Christmas, I might want to brainstorm some ideas. So first I'll think of different things I can get. I can get her a game, I can get her a pet, I can get her a toy, I can get her clothes or a laptop, and I'll just keep listing off ideas that are all in this same category of things that I can get. Then finally at some point I'll say like, okay, I've generated enough ideas. I want to pick one of those ideas. You know what? I think we need a pet in the house. I think it'd be great for her to have a pet. It'd teach her responsibility and it provides some companionship, so I'm going to who narrow down all my options to pets. So then I move vertically down, and then I start listing out the different possible pets that we can have. Well, we could get a bird, we could get a cat, we can get a dog, we can get a hamster, we can get a fish. I'll generate all these ideas, and once I feel like I have sufficient number of ideas, I'll do the same thing. I'll look and I'll filter of the ideas. Be like, oh, birds, I'm not sure how we'd keep them. They'd be loud. Cats, I'm allergic to cats, so that won't do. A fish, that might be nice, but I don't know if a fish would necessarily give her the companionship that she's looking for, or a hamster for that case, same thing. So, you know what? I'm going to go with the dog. So now I've narrowed everything down to a dog. Now I'm going to move down vertically and then start listing out ideas horizontally, and then I'll go through and try to figure out what type of dog I want. So I'll start listing ideas out horizontally. We can get a golden retriever, a German shepherd, a Dalmatian, a husky, a sheepoo. And then now that I have all these ideas, I'll narrow it down once again. I'll think of, oh, German shepherd and golden retriever. Both are very active. Same with a Dalmatian and a husky. We have a little bit quieter of a house, so maybe we don't want something so active. Also, I'm not going to be able to walk the dog that much, and she's not at the age where she can take the dog out. So perhaps it'd be better if we go with a smaller dog. How about let's go with the Shipu? And then at that point, I decide, you know what? I don't care about what color the Shipu is or all these other attributes. I'm just going to be satisfied with the Shipu. Therefore, to answer my question, what should I get my child for Christmas? I'm going to get her a Shipu. And I will cut it off at there. So this is the general idea for how you brainstorm. A lot of times with brainstorming, it's not necessarily as direct or specific as problem solving. Usually with structured problem solving, there's a lot higher stakes or there's a specific pain point you're trying to get, where brainstorming is more trying to be creative, or you're just trying to come up with things. One tip of advice, if somebody is asking you to brainstorm ideas for them, something you should do is you should start out moving horizontally and then ask them. Once you've listed out a couple ideas, you should then ask them, okay, do you like any of the ideas that I've given? Like, do you want me to continue moving horizontally? Do you want me to continue listing out ideas, or should we go and dig deeper in one of those ideas? And this is a really good way to gauge to make sure that you're using their time as effectively as possible and you're helping them get the results that they want to get. For instance, going back to this idea, this example that we have here, say if my spouse comes up to me and asks, me the question, what should we get our child for Christmas? Then I'll say, well, we could get her a game, we could get her a pet, we could get her a toy, we can get her clothes, we could get her a laptop, and then ask, do any of these ideas sound particularly interesting to you? And my spouse may say, yes, I think the pet sounds like a great idea, or she might say, no, I don't really like any of those ideas. In the case that she says, yes, pet sounds great, then I'd go down and then I'd start listing out different types of pets. However, if she says she doesn't really like any of those ideas, then I'd keep listing out horizontally. So just that's something to keep in mind next time that you're brainstorming. Try to follow a more systematic approach. You'll find that you can generate a lot more ideas a lot quicker and also keep them well organized.